Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you today to the BCM Leadership Services webinar today with evaluating your BIA results. And I will tell you this, I've been in business continuity almost 30 years. There's nothing more that strikes fear in anyone's heart, whether you're just a brand new person of business continuity or if you've been doing this for many years. It comes down when you have to come down and evaluate your results and present those. So that's what we're going to talk about, evaluating results and getting you prepared. For that day, you got to either meet with IT or you got to meet with management to present those results. And more importantly, in the end, get their buy-in and get their approval to move forward with your results. I'm Michael Herrera, CEO of MHA Consulting. MHA Consulting now has been in business for over 20 years. Prior to starting MHA Consulting, I was a regional vice president with Bank of America. Left Bank of America in 1999. 22 years later, MHA Consulting is a well-known boutique business continuity consulting firm, not just domestically, but globally. During that time as well, we've developed a separate company called BCM Metrics, and BCM Metrics houses all of our software as a service tools for business continuity, from assessing your compliance, completing your BIA, developing your plans, and then storing all your plans and sites on a map for easy access, not only to information about each site, but that information as well. We have a very unique, or as I always say, a unique competitive advantage in that we've been blessed to work across all silos of industry, not just one, which, especially in the BIA space, really has shown us how do you apply the BIA process and methodology, which is, again, applied consistently across these industries, but has to take into account the culture and the approach, also understanding people's different recovery timeframes, recovery points, needs of certain systems, manual workarounds, legal regulatory requirements. So we've gained a tremendous wealth of knowledge of working across so many industries, and how does the BIA need to work within each particular type of industry, and is also within the culture of that. Lastly, I'll just mention, as you well know, we provide end-to-end consulting services from just completing BIAs all the way through developing the entire program. So we're well versed in any and all areas of the business continuity lifecycle. What are we going to talk about today? So today we're going to talk about evaluating your BIA results, making the assumption that you've had a successful BIA. And I will tell you this right now. BIA is never perfect, and there are always going to be people that don't agree with it, whether they've participated in every interview with you. There'll be times that even when management has helped you set up your BIA, in the end, don't expect them to always agree with your results. And you know what? And that's not a bad thing, because you want people to take a good look at what you produced, have a good understanding, and provide feedback. You know, you do worry at times. I know myself as a professional, when you go in as a consulting professional, you present the results and there's no response and no feedback. You want that response and feedback to just make sure, is everybody okay with what we came up with? So remember, it's not a perfect science. You want to get through it, but make sure you're prepared. Things we're going to cover today: the importance of a sound methodology and making sure that before I go and present my results, is guess what? We've done a good job in making sure everything looks good, making sure everything's correct. We didn't get anything wrong. We didn't miss anything. Also making sure that BIA team that we bring is a really good cross-functional team to make sure that our BIA results have been scrubbed properly before we go through and present those as well. Making sure, again, did you review the results as you went along? How many times we watch different business continuity offices, they go through the entire BIA and have not done any review along the way. So instead of only having 4 to 5 issues at the end, they may have 40, 50 issues to deal with because they haven't done a good BIA review and scrubbing process throughout their entire BIA study. Now, preparing for the management presentation, we're going to talk about that. Every management team is different. FinTech firms, I guarantee you come in, you better be able to present a presentation in 2 to 3 slides. Others that are highly regulated may want more formal. They may want the formal BIA report. They're going to want a formal management presentation. You need to understand your management team and, most importantly, how they want this presented. So not only making sure the data and the information is solid and correct and you can stand behind it, but making sure that presentation and the way you present it to them makes sense for them so they can easily accept it, take it in, digest it, and again, provide the appropriate feedback. And then lastly, probably one of the hardest thing is once we get that feedback and approval, we'll talk about how do I go and align this with information technology? And you need to be prepared again for how did you come up with this information? How did you come up with why this particular business unit needs system A, B, and C in this time frame? You just have to be prepared and have a thick skin, but more importantly, be able to say you can stand behind your results. So You know, a lot of times when we do BIAs, we're always focused about the technical tasks. You know, well, did we do this right? Did we get this? Did we identify this? Did it calculate the RTO and the RPO properly? But it really comes down in the end, how do I present these results so everybody takes it in, agrees with or disagrees, but has good constructive reasons why? And you can come to some sort of agreement as to really what is critical and what is not at your company and move forward with the results of the BIA. So you can now move forward with strategies, with plans, etc. So that's what we're going to take a good close look at today. So very important, and I highly recommend this, and we do this at MHA. During a BIA, we're constantly reviewing the results, and we'll do this on a regular basis. So a lot of times, typically at the end of most weeks, when we're in the midst of BIA studies, we're reviewing what went through those particular interviews during the week. So simple things. We see so many errors in all of these areas that, again, will cause you trouble in the end, because I guarantee you, you will forget. Well, how was this information gathered? Why was it gathered this way? It's very important that you do this on a regular, consistent basis so that it minimizes those errors, such as, have we just copied all the right business information? The name of the department, what it does, what are the peak times? Has all of that appropriately been captured? Who did we interview? Has their name, their email, their phone number, if you capture that? Has all of that basic information about that business unit been captured? How many times you will get asked, who did you interview as part of this process, so I can go back to them and get more information? You better make sure you have that. It's all basic information. So make sure as you're going through the BIA, business unit information, it is all current, correct, and makes sense. Number 2, is the list of business unit processes complete and relevant? How many times we'll take a look at business units and guess what? They'll put a system as a process and nobody catches that. There'll be other things of that nature where business unit processes don't make sense, or their activities. So you need to make sure and look at all of the processes by department. Are all of the process complete and relevant? And do they make sense for that department? Make sure, again, these are high-level processes, not a minutia of tasks, which we've seen before. So making sure, again, you can take, yes, these are the things that we know this department performs. Now, I will tell you, for those of you that are newer to business continuity, the BIA is a phenomenal way for you to get to understand your company. You will now understand what are the processes, what really goes on in the trenches. So again, this is a great way for you to learn, to really know the processes your company performs. So get entrenched in it. Don't just go through the steps of conducting the BIA. Get to know the business units and what they do, their peak times. Get to know their processes. You will become a black belt in that knowledge of your company. Take advantage of it. Now, here comes a third one, and this is where a lot of business continuity groups will say, well, I don't really understand IT. Well, you know what? You really do need to. You can't just say, I just do business continuity. I don't do IT or ITDR. This is a great time to understand those systems and applications. Understand what those business units are doing. Make sure the list of systems and applications are complete. They align with what IT calls them as well. This is why it's so important to always invite, even though they may not show up, make sure IT is part of your interviews. Make sure they're there. Doesn't mean they'll always take you up, but this is a good time as you're reviewing the results. Have we missed any systems or applications a unit may need? Very importantly, is the system run in-house or is it third party? What's the reliance on? Has that been forgotten? Understanding, is it a low, medium, or high reliance? What's the RPO? Do they have a workaround? These are all simple checkpoints, just making sure as you've gone through these interviews that you haven't forgotten anything on the system and application list, because this will drive you crazy in the end when you've got to take that list of systems and applications that are prioritized by RTO and RPO. You got to make sure it's comprehensive and complete when you take it to IT, so that minimizes any areas of discussion that you don't want to have with IT. You want to make sure your list is perfect. And then lastly, number 4, we'll continue with a few others, but also very important, as part of your review process of the BIA that's already taken place, are all the impacts, your financial and non-financial impacts. Is it all correct? Did it make sense? When you look at the departments you've completed those BIAs for, are those impacts appropriate based on what the business unit does, what the process is, and more importantly, does it align with the mission of your organization? Real simple. On the healthcare side, it's really simple. When you look at what processes should be critical, well, those are all that are aligned with patient care and safety. Banking, it has to do with all of the customer service and financial transactions. So every company is a little bit different, but it's pretty much, common sense, and making sure as you go through this and making sure the impacts that were entered, make sure that the process is then aligned with the company and the process and its mission. Also reviewing the results. Don't forget dependencies. internal or external. This is becoming absolutely critical today. Can I really map what my department depends on internally as well as externally, so we get a really good idea who within the company we have the most significant reliance, who externally do we have the most significant reliance, do we have workarounds? You don't want to forget these, because again, it's important as you do your mapping over time, who depends on who, and then making sure the RTOs are appropriately aligned. Have you captured all the service levels and legal and regulatory requirements? This is going to be key, as you will see a little later in the presentation when we discuss what factors influence the RTO or RPO. Service levels, regulatory, legal requirements, all of those items influence RTO and RPO. So very important that you make sure you captured that, so that if you have to talk to management, they ask why specifically, you can also then go back to whether it's service level agreements, whether it's particular regulatory issues, etc. Manual workarounds. With the advent of ransomware, and it's so widely being, again, in today's corporate America, manual workarounds are coming back. We have been surprised in the past few weeks how many organizations said, I just need you to come in, take a look at the business units and the critical systems they identified, and we actually need to go try to figure out what manual workarounds are going to be. And it's no longer lip service. They actually are looking to how long could they run their companies without any technology. So manual workarounds are critical. Vital records, make sure you've listed all those. This can be electronic, it can be paper, it can be microfiche. Any piece of data information that if it's lost, that process is critically impacted. And then lastly, after you've gone and reviewed this, and I always recommend, don't wait to the end to review your BIA study as you're conducting it. Review it in chunks so that when you get to the end, you've pretty much cleaned up all the BIA data and information you've gathered. And lastly, just make sure all the calculated RTOs and RPOs make sense. We've already kind of discussed that. Just make sure, just give it a common sense test and making sure, you know what, I feel pretty good that we're about 90% correct, because there's always going to be some changes. You can't always be 100%, but at least, so you can see reviewing the results is really sets you up for the validation of the data. Don't wait to the end, do it on a regular basis, because a lot of times even the business units will miss things. So take that, very important there. All right, now, so once you've reviewed this and you've gotten everybody, you've reviewed the results, each of the areas have looked at it. Now here's what's important. So once you've done your review and that business unit manager that you've interviewed, you do want to ask them for that final sign off, because that not only have you done their review, they've done it. So now you can now move to the next part, which is actually the validation by your BIA validation team. So getting those sign-offs are important. So it's not just you saying it's correct. Also, the business unit manager or other participants agree and say, yes, we're good. Now we're ready to move on. Now, before I get to factors influencing the RTO as we're looking at the BIA results, remember who should be on your BIA validation team. These should be pretty much the individuals who help you set up the BIA, those individuals who provided input. It's IT. It could be other key business leaders, people that's on your team that helped you throughout the BIA process, key people that you had as your project team or your engagement team in order to conduct the BIA. These people typically, they need to be subject matter experts in your organization. You want people that can talk to the different processes or units or operations across the organization. So it needs to be cross-functional nature. And it's always good. Again, a lot of times today, it's really hard to get IT directly involved in the BIA until the end when we're trying to align the results. But if you can, it's always great when they're involved throughout the process, because there's already buy-in because they've seen every interview. Because I will tell you what will happen in the end. It doesn't matter if they've been in every interview. When you go and present the results, they'll still raise their hand and say, I have no clue how in the world that RTO came out. So you just got to be ready for these types of things that are going to happen in these sessions. Don't take it personally. You just got to move with it and just make sure you're as best prepared as you can. So remember, as you guys are validating your results, just remember and go back and look. Remember the factors that influence the recovery time objective or the time frame in which the process needs to be recovered before material impact occurs. One, what's the dollar impact to the organization? How significant? Loss of revenue, impact to liquidity, penalties and fines and sanctions, etc. Loss in interest income, all of those critical impacts from a financial perspective. Again, if it's significant, influences the RTO. Very importantly, the qualitative impacts. When you look at a business unit and you look at their qualitative impacts, customer service and experience, patient safety and care, brand image and reputation, legal impacts, regulatory, operating efficiencies, all of those qualitative impacts, again, that you've got to understand. So the quantitative again, with the qualitative, really are key factors that are influencing that RTO over time. So you got to make sure that, remember that. That is key to understand, and be prepared to explain that to your management team as well as IT when you go through the process, which we'll discuss in a second. Also, is this process strategic to the company mission? That also influences the RTO. And sometimes, guess what? It may not be critical now, but in 6 months, a year, it might be strategic to the company mission. So it may change the RTO. So again, understand how strategic is this business unit and process or processes to that company mission. That's why, too, I always tell business continuity, one of the things we always assess as we're looking at people's skill sets, what's your knowledge of the company and the company's mission, so that when you go off and do BIAs, you have a good understanding. Yes, this business unit is critical to our mission, or no, it's essential, or it's important, or it can be deferred. So you kind of already have that base understanding before you go do the BIA. And when you come out, then you can say, here's how I understand what factors really influence the RTO of one or all of the units. Cost to recover. Again, that also influences the RTO. You kind of already know which units, again, you already kind of know which one's already strategic and critical. The cost to recover is going to influence the RTO, okay? So we know some are going to cost a lot to recover. We're going to have, in some cases, have real-time recovery capabilities, and that is not cheap. I always tell people today, if you need a process to be recovered in 48 hours or less, you typically, in today's complex world, basically need to have everything pre-set up. It's pretty difficult. Ability to recover is also the same. Making sure how difficult and complex is the ability to recover. That's going to influence the RTO. And then lastly, this is one thing you can't control, is management says so. They either say the RTO is wrong and they want it moved, or they want it moved either to a shorter or a longer time frame. Here's the issue. A lot of times what happens when management says so, they're not in the trenches. A lot of senior managers no longer in the trenches. That's why it's so important when you come back and say, here's who within the unit provided us this information. Let them talk to it. Let them go back to them if they need to. Let them make sure you got the right people who talk to the processes, who do it every day. Very important. All right. Now, also, as you go through validation and getting your team looking at everything, remember, look at anything else that could impact the business processes, not just today, but into the future. There's nothing better than being able to tell management, hey, we know things are happening. We also know this RTO may not be critical now, but maybe we're going to go through a merger or acquisition. It's going to completely change how these processes or these units operate and their recovery time objectives. Also, closure facilities. It's amazing what you find out when you're doing the business impact analysis, when we always ask, are there any reorganizations, anything of that nature, anything being closed down in the near future? You got to get that information. Amazing the type of information you find, how your organization is changing very quickly. Additionally, are any new systems coming online? Okay, a lot of times, yes, that could completely change the recovery time objectives, not only of the process, but all of its dependencies. So that's important, understanding what new systems are coming online and what changes you may have to make, not just today, but look into the future of that process and all of its dependencies. And then lastly, any threats and risk. As part of the BIA, you should be doing even a small form of a risk assessment with that business unit and understanding what are any single points of failure, any other risk to that business unit. So you can see as you're validating all of this information you've aggregated, you're not looking at not only at the factors influencing the RTO, you're looking at everything else around that's happening within your business that could influence these recovery time objectives. So understanding all of these items. And then lastly, again, the hardest one, and this is one that, again, we definitely see, what influences the recovery point objective? If there's anything that gets people wound up is when they see what recovery point objective or what's the maximum tolerance for permanent data loss that gets IT going and other areas of the business as much as the RTO. Because everybody's saying, what do you mean they can't lose any data? And everybody always thinks, well, yes, they can. They got workarounds, or they have a way to get the data back in, or we can resynchronize the systems. It's not always the case. So that's why it's also important, again, in validating the data and have your notes and information ready. So when you go to management and say, hey, this business unit, maximum RPO for this system is 15 minutes or less. You better be able to talk to it, because management's going to say, that's going to cost a lot. How are we going to do that? Do we need real-time replication? How can we get this all done? It's going to cost us a lot. We don't do it today. So things you got to make sure you're ready to talk to. You got to make sure, well, are there a lot of legal regulatory requirements? Are your customers requiring it? Are you, for example, under other regulatory needs where it's right, there is no potential for data loss. You just can't afford it. It supports critical functions, and those critical functions may have no manual workarounds. How many, I'm sure all of you listening today, You have those areas within your operating environment, where they have no manual workarounds. Data goes in, there's no way they can go back and re-enter, and you really don't want them to, because if they did, it's going to be inaccurate, it's going to take too long, and we all reach that point when we're recovering, where really there's a law of diminishing returns, where if the event goes this long, we basically won't be able to get the data in. It's just way too much, the volume, the complexity, all of those things. And also, a lot of people today, there's nobody left that understands manual workarounds. If you saw with the Colonial Pipeline, they were just mentioning this yesterday, that again, they're looking to go back to manual operation of the entire pipeline. The issue is there's not many people left that know how to man it, to run a pipeline completely manually. So remember that. That also influences the RPO, lack of manual workarounds. If I had a list of all the data I entered and the system goes down, well, that's no problem when it comes up. I'll enter it back in. If I don't have all those workarounds and items in place to redo that, your RPO is going to be affected. Is the data strategic to your initiatives? I already talked about synchronization and complexity. There's a lot of data today that get touched by multiple systems. So again, that influences the RPO. If data gets been touched by 4 or 5 systems on its way to the final system that it sits in, guess what? That synchronization complexity can be massive, and really you can't lose anything. The amount of data and being able to, again, get that back into the system, the cost to back up, the ability to restore. There's a lot of systems. Data backups have improved dramatically in today's environment, but it's not always easy to restore all this data and information in a way that when it gets back and restored, everything's in sync and we're ready to go. And again, also management says so. All right, that's always the point I always tell people. You may do all this work, you do all this evaluation and validation, just be prepared for that in the end. So the BIA validation, how does that work? So get your cross-functional BIA team together, sit down, have an open mind. This is why it's also very important during your BIA, please take good notes. Please take good notes, because I will tell you, when you do 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 100, you're not going to remember interview 1 or interview 100. I'm going to tell you that. So it's so important that you not only checked all the information you gathered in that BIA, have good solid notes that you keep for each business unit. So when you go through this cross-functional team validation, any questions that come up, you should have enough information in that interview that you conducted. You can go back to and look at and go, okay, here's why. Here's why this financial impact was so high in the first 24 hours, or customer service impact was so high, or why they need as many systems. Make sure you have great notes on the business unit. I will tell you, running a consulting firm, having great notes has saved us so many times when we're in the middle of management presentations and they ask questions A, B, and C. We simply go back to that BIA and say, here's the notes on why this particular aspect of their BIA interview was handled this way, or why impacts, et cetera, were identified as such. So BIA validation, just making sure, again, go through these areas. Process RTOs. When you line up all the process RTOs across your company, do they all just make sense? Are they aligned with the mission? Is what you need in the first 72 hours of your company, is it really what will keep you up and running? You should know your company well enough and do a sniff test and go, you know what? That looks really good. Basically, what I know about the company, here's what we need in the first 72, 5 days, and these things I know can be deferred just based on what I know about the company. Your team should be able to look at that and say, there's nothing crazy up there. Same thing with the system RTOs. Are there systems supporting each of those timeframes that make sense with what the business does and when you know it's needed? Again, most of the time, by having a good cross-functional team, making sure the data is clean, you will find this cross-functional process review is not going to take hours or days. You should already be able to get to it, and the data should be clean enough that it should be a simple look at where do we at process-wise, system and application over the time frame. Give it that good cross-check. There may be a few that you're like, what is that system? I will tell you this. One of the things we find with system RTOs, or just systems in nature and applications, in today's BIAs, we always ask IT, could you please provide us with an accurate list from your configuration management database if they have one, or if they don't, could you just provide us with a good list of the systems and applications you're responsible for? And even today, IT will give you that list. When you go to the business units, I'm going to tell you this, it doesn't matter how good that list is, business units in a lot of cases are going to call systems different names. And you're going to be working with a business unit, and they're going to be calling it System XYZ, and IT calls it System C. And so this is why it's so important, looking at all this and making sure it's clean. making sure you're not going to probably, if you can't get to them all and you get 80% accuracy, 90%, it's a point in time snapshot. You do your best. All right. Also, then once we've looked at the process and system RTOs, this is again the crux of what management's going to chew you up on if they're not right. You want to make sure that you feel confident in that. At that point, then we go off and identify and resolve any issues in alignment of processes with systems with the mission of their organization. There's nothing worse that, and it can be one system that you may have listed that supposedly needs to be recovered in 12 hours. Management sees that system and says, "What were you people thinking?" That system can be deferred for 5 to 10 days, and they'll harp on it. So make sure everything's aligned properly. That makes sense. Once you've done that, address the next steps in the planning processes. Get ready to present that list of systems and processes to IT. So you need to get ready for that. Start getting all that put together, because once management approves it, you're going to want to take this information over to IT so they can begin to look at, here's when the business needs it, here's what I can do today, and what are the gaps. So again, make sure process RTOs are valid and make sense for the company. Same thing goes for the systems. Look at any alignment issues you may have between the two. Resolve them. Go back to the business unit if needed. Look at your notes. Be able to adjust and make changes to the BIA if needed. Now, if you've done a good job, those changes should be minimal to the BIAs. But we've been on cases where we've had to go back and make revisions to the BIAs with the business units. It's few and far between if you do a good job. But don't be afraid to go back to the business unit, get some more information, or say, hey, you know what, we looked at this again. We may have to push back. Or we may tell them, you know what, you may be more critical than you think. All right. So once it's all done, you should be now formalize the process and system RTOs and RPOs. And in the perfect world, this is a great little chart that came out years ago. Down at the bottom is the recovery time. Left-hand axis there is the impact in dollars. As you can see here, the business impact here goes up, and it should intersect where the cost to recover. What's the optimum recovery strategy if this was only perfect, right? And I will tell you, this is what you'd want in the perfect world. Does it exist? Oh, maybe 1%, 5% of the time. But you're really trying to marry where the business impact intersects with the cost to recover. What I still see is sadly a lot of times we go off, we do this phenomenal BIA, we find the information, we validate it, we clean it, we scrub it, and guess what? Management does nothing with it. Or they look at it and they may say, yeah, I agree with 70%, but here's what I'm going to do. So those are the sad things. And again, but I think in today's world, people are recognizing at least provides a foundation and some baseline to see where do you stand and does it make sense as to what needs to be recovered in what order for your company. All right, preparing to meet with IT. This is critical. So first and foremost, be prepared for disagreement with the results of the BIA. And business continuity office people, please know your systems. Please know your systems. Know what they do. Know which units use them. Before you meet with IT, understand them. Understand what they do. It doesn't mean that you have to understand every screen or everything about the system, but have a good basic knowledge of the systems so that when you talk to IT as to why group selected them the way they did, you can at least talk to them. But be prepared for disagreement, because basically what you're coming to IT with is saying, here's what the business says they need to recover it in. And in most cases, a lot of time, guess what? Poor IT, they've been given this job years ago, and they're basically have been thrown into coming up with RTOs that they just came up with. They were told years ago, hey, you need to come with some RTOs and recover our systems. And here you come along years later with this BIA saying, hey, you were all wrong. So be prepared for disagreement. And as long as you're ready for that, just take it with a grain of salt and move on. Number two, you do have to remind them that IT is driving, or business is driving the RTOs of these processes and all of the dependencies. Doesn't mean you can't work together with IT to come up with some sort of what works kumbaya, what works good for all of us. But you got to remind them that, hey, the business is driving this, and they're driving the RTOs of all of the dependencies, which systems is one of those pieces that's what's most concerning to them, right? Now, again, I always like to review the IT with IT, how we did the BIA, especially if they didn't participate. So they understand there's rigor behind it. There's an approach. There's a methodology. It wasn't you just sitting down with the business units and saying, hey, we all know you're critical. Really, how critical are you? So you want to make sure you review that BIA process in IT so they have a good feeling, or at least you hope they have a good feeling as to, you know what, these folks put some thought behind it. There's some reasoning, and it makes sense as to why certain things came out as they did. Okay, so number 4, review the process RTOs and the systems that support them, so they understand here's the processes, here's the supporting systems in what recovery timeframe order. Remember that, as well as the RPOs, and hopefully by you doing a good job of explaining the business is driving the RTOs. Here's how we conducted it. Here's what came up from an RTO and RPO perspective. And it does align with the mission of our company. It makes sense. You also want them to look at that and say, gosh, I agree. Or here's some areas that, you know what, you may want to go back and look at. That's okay. All right. And then lastly, remember, as they start to work and get ready with this, you're gonna also want them to look at the gaps, because as you look at RTOs, some could be very stringent, some deferrable. How good is IT at meeting that? Now, be prepared as well. Sometimes IT doesn't want to tell you whether they're even meeting or exceeding the RTOs or not being able to meet those RTOs. I've seen both. I've seen IT groups that are excellent and they got great recovery times, and actually they're exceeding what the BIA says for the RTO. They don't want to tell the business unit, because they're like, well, if we tell them that, they're going to want to even go shorter. And then on the flip side, sometimes they may not want to tell you how bad the situation is. So you got to just be prepared for all of this, have a good relationship with IT to get you ready for this. Hopefully get their validation of what you came up with, even if it's just, hey, we agree with 80% of it. Here's the other items we need to go address. Can you go off and get this back to us and work with it? Because it's always, remember, point in time snapshot, and it's a work in progress. So you hope if everything goes perfect, they start to initiate some DR planning based on what you came up with, maybe adjustments to existing programs, or in some cases, they may not have anything. So you're now providing them that baseline of what types of recovery strategies and capabilities need to be implemented by your company, which we all know it will take people, time, money, and resources. So this BIA is critical to the organization, because you are driving recovery strategies and technologies, not just 1 year, 2 years, but down the road, and the same thing from the business side. So this is documented, and the foundation of the BIA is critical. All right, the management report. This is probably where we see, again, as a consulting firm, we try to be as adaptive as possible, because every management team is different. When you're working in the banking world, everything is very formal. Others, they just want a deck. Just give me a 2 to 3 page deck, or 2 to 3 pages on what the results were and what it means. So you need to decide on the format and structure of the report first. You've done the data scrubbing and cleanup. You've done the BIA validation. IT's agreed with you. Now, as you're creating this, like, what works best for our management team, especially if you're meeting, for example, the Business Continuity Steering Committee, know who they are. You have those that, I will tell you, love to look at detail. They'll go through the entire report. You have those that will not read your report. So when you go to the meeting, they're flipping through, and guess what? They're gonna just call things out as they see them there. So you have those that are organized, you have those that'll do it at the time, and you have those that won't read anything, and they're gonna just listen to what you're saying. So remember that in creating your management report and presentation. Understand the key people that are coming to your meeting, and be prepared for those that are gonna raise their hand. So you gotta make sure in the background, you got your folks ready to answer any questions regarding the BIA and how it was calculated. So I always like to make sure we prepare and issue the draft report to whoever our senior point of contact is, and as well, so we can make sure everybody agrees, hey, this is what we're going to put out. Are there, again, say something or forever hold your peace, making sure everybody agrees with it, because we're going to present it. And I will tell you, as a consulting firm, this is where we really we have to be so careful, because we don't want to go into those. I've been in those management meetings where things can go really wrong with 1 to 2 errors, either in process RTOs or system RTOs. You've got to make sure this is solid. All right, once you've got a review of the draft, making sure that, again, everything looks good in the report from its content, its some information, etc., you issue the final report. Make sure, again, that report, however they want it issue. In the more formal, we always say who's participated in their level management and who requested the BIA. So make sure. All right. And then lastly, if anything, you're going to, once they get the report, any final feedback, etc. So here's an idea as to what we use in the report, in a more formalized BIA report. The executive summary, no more than 2 pages. Tell me what the BIA was about, what its results were, etc. Business unit process priority. You list that very quickly so they get a quick snapshot based on our company. Here's what's critical. In the first 5 days, for example, I typically don't list everything. I just list, here's in a summary, here's what we came up with, here's what's critical in your company. Here's a system, next is a system and application priority. These are the systems and applications supporting those business unit and processes, critical internal and external dependencies, vital records, findings and recommendations, and appendices. So you can see it provides a very good idea as to what you want in a more formal report. You can adjust these. We have some clients that all they want is the executive summary. They don't want anything else, and that's okay. So again, adjust to the thinking and thought process of your management and what they'd like to see, and just making sure you get the right approach to them that makes sense. So in the end, they validate those results so you can go forward with it. This is not an easy process. It's not perfect. And I wish I could tell you by following this process that it was going to be perfect every time. It is not. I don't care how many times we've done this. Recently, we completed for an organization over 150 BIAs. And I will tell you what's interesting. And when we went to validate, those individuals, the individuals that were on our team, basically had been through every one of those 150 interviews. Hard to believe, right? From the management. There's a management team that was with us on every one of those interviews. Even when we got done, even though they were with us on every interview, they still were questioning why certain things came out the way they did at the end once we aggregated all of the data. So no, it doesn't matter. Be prepared. This is imperfect. All right. So this is probably the one thing. I've, again, done this so many years, but I will tell you, it always strikes fear in you when you've got to be the one presenting these results. It's kind of coming in with the good news and the bad news, because management's going to look at this and go, and say, what are the findings and recommendations to the senior management in your reports? You got to be prepared in meeting with them. You're going to present those findings and recommendations. Be prepared to review the BIA process, to most importantly, defend your findings. That's absolutely critical. And then discuss the risk and recommendations chosen for that. So that's really important. You got to be able to stand behind it. Kind of like what I was saying before, is making sure you have that team behind you that if there are questions, you can ask. Who did we interview? When was this conducted? Could you go back and take a look at that BIA to make sure so you can answer any particular questions that come up? Because they will. Because I tell you, when you have senior executives and they can all talk to areas of your company, they're going to say, well, who did you interview within my unit? Why did that individual come up with that RTO? Could you tell me what the impacts were? That will happen. You'll have those individuals raise a hand. You've got to be ready for that so that your BIA presentation doesn't fall apart. And if you've done everything I've said here, scrub the data, validated it, made sure IT looked at it and said, yeah, here's some things that, we got to go fix. So by the time you meet with management, your report should be pretty solid, okay? So once that you've presented the findings and recommendation, you defended the process as needed, you discussed the risk, you now are ready to say, okay, here's the next steps. Senior management, here's what we're going to do. We're now going to go back and formally align this and get a gap analysis with IT, and we're going to go off now to create strategies and plans not only for the business but technology if needed. And then again, in the end, it's their job to validate and agree. In the perfect world, you do want a formal signature. In today's world, it's more of, hey, does everybody attest to this and say we're ready to go with it? But you do want management, whether it's one individual or it's a group, that has that authority to sign off on this. Because here's what will happen. And I've had this happen before. Go off, we do the BIA, management says everything looks good. We go off and take it to IT or other groups to go do things, and they'll say, who approved this? I don't have a signature. I don't have to do this. Just a report that was written. So you do want that formal attestation that says, we agree to this, and from this point going forward, we're going to align with what came out of this BIA to develop the remainder of our program and ongoing development. One of the questions that I got asked recently is still, how often should we do the BIAs? Every organization is different. I know in a lot of heavy regulated organizations today, from the financial world, et cetera, they're asking for BIAs to be done annually. The average is every 2 years. We have a utility where in their policy, nothing changes a lot. They do their BIAs every 3 years. What we're also recommending in highly complex organizations today, where there's hundreds of BIAs to be conducted, is more of a tiering process. Be able to tier your areas and say, if you fall into our critical tier, guess what? We are going to have to do a BIA annually. If you fall into our important, we're going to do this every 2 years. If you're other, guess what? You're going to do your own BIA, and you'll do it every 3 years, for example. So you got to look at what makes sense for you. There's no hard and fast rule. But again, I think the BIA is not dead, as many have stated. It's still here. and we're going to use it for a while. Let's just hope it gets better and better over time. All right. Last thing I'll just say, keys to BIA success. Don't forget these. Scope your BIA appropriately so it makes sense. So as you go through this entire process, you can handle it. Make sure that data gathering plan, like I talked about, and everything you gather during the interviews is good so that when you go to scrub it, it makes sense. You don't have anything in there that doesn't make sense or it's not essential. Again, during the BIA, you have objective data and subjective data in helping you calculate the RTOs and RPOs. It's not a perfect science. You have humans involved. So it's never going to be absolutely perfect as much people want it. Make sure, and again, as I said, to make sure your BIA is successful as much as possible. This is why we involve them up front. We let them know what the BIA is and what it isn't, what to expect out of it. Get as much executive advice up front because it'll help you in the end when you go to validation and management presentations, because they won't be able to tell you, I had no clue what was happening in this BIA. Always involve them, even if it's a 30-minute briefing that says, we're doing a BIA, here's who we're interviewing, here's what you're going to get out of it, and here's what you're not going to get out of it. I've had management say, okay, we've done the BIA, we're done now, right? We don't have to do anymore. You got to prepare them, all right? 5, get that validation so you can move forward. And then again, most importantly, align all this with IT so they can get their DR recovery in place as well. Okay, folks, well, if there are no questions today, I hope this was helpful. Again, this has been recorded, so you'll be able to go back and listen to it as well. I want to thank everybody for their valuable time today, and I hope this was helpful. Remember, go out there, do your BIA properly, make sure you have a sound methodology and a good cross-functional team, do your review and validation. And again, it's not a perfect science, all right? That is the one thing I want you to all to remember. So thank you for joining us today. The presentation will be available for download later this week. We'll be sending a link of the email addresses off to you. And then please join us next month for the next BIA leadership webinar in our series here. So again, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.